the Great War, World War I, the war to end all wars, whatever you want to call it. This conflict is a pivotal moment in human history. The United States entered the fray in 1917, coming to the aid of our European allies against the Central Powers. After fighting for nearly 3 years, we helped secure victory and bring an end to hostilities in November 1918. But at what cost? It's me. Welcome to my channel. And today we're going to find out what the price of victory was for the United States in World War I. World War I had been raging in Europe since 1914. At first, the conflict seemed far removed from America's shores. President Woodrow Wilson declared strict neutrality and even prohibited American companies from selling munitions to either side. However, as the war dragged on, the U.S. became increasingly tied to the fate of the British Empire. This was due in no small part to economic interests. Over 40% of U.S. foreign investments were located in Britain and her colonies. In addition, most of the shipping used to transport American goods to international markets was owned by British companies. Moreover, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare campaign in the Atlantic threatened American lives and property. German U-boats sank 3 U.S. merchant ships in 1915 alone. By 1916, over 600 American seamen had perished due to enemy action. Finally, the British blockade of Germany prevented the importation of much-needed foodstuffs into the United States. For all these reasons and more, the U.S. entered the conflict in April 1917. Now, despite being late to the party, the U.S. had the resources to make a massive impact on the war. In fact, it's often said that America's entry into the conflict was the turning point that ultimately secured victory for the Allies. In order to pay for the tremendous costs of waging war, however, the federal government would need to raise a great deal of money. To fund the war effort, the Treasury Department issued over $20 billion in bonds through a series of public subscription drives. These drives were incredibly successful, raising more money than the government anticipated every step of the way. In fact, Americans ended up purchasing nearly twice as many bonds as were actually needed to finance the war. Perhaps this eagerness to invest in the war was driven by the belief that buying bonds was a patriotic duty. Or maybe people simply believed that investing in the war was a sound financial decision. Either way, the U.S. had the money it needed to fight a long and costly war. But just where was all this money coming from? Much of it came from ordinary Americans. While the wealthy elite made significant contributions, the average person gave what they could. This was especially true after the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. When public sentiment turned sharply against the Germans and in favor of the war, in the drive to sell bonds, the Treasury Department employed some pretty creative methods. The slogan "Help Win the War" was painted on everything from baby carriages to Pullman cars. Even baseball cards got in on the action, with the 1918 to 1919 American Tobacco Company's World Series set sporting the slogan "Buy a Liberty Bond." Despite such efforts, though, only about 1/3 of the money raised came from individual investors. The other 2/3 came from corporate interests and the banking industry. Large corporations were happy to contribute to the war effort, but not without some strings attached. Companies who purchased large blocks of bonds were given a say in the affairs of the federal government. Not only did they have the power to influence policy, but they also gained exemption from certain regulations. Additionally, the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to encourage borrowing and investment in the war. By the end of the conflict, nearly 33% of the nation's currency was controlled by the federal government. With the money in hand, the United States could now turn its attention to winning the war. The first order of business was drafting men into service. On May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which required men between the ages of 21 and 32 register for the draft. Men were not allowed to dodge the draft by volunteering to serve in non-combat roles either. As it turned out, there were not enough weapons for everyone after all. Nearly 24 million men registered for the draft. Of those, 2.4 million were selected to serve. In the end, though, the United States did not need all those draftees. Only about 2 million served overseas. Those who served stateside took on vital roles in manufacturing, farming, and industrial labor. Women, too, played a huge role in the American war effort. Nearly 1/3 of women of working age were employed outside the home by 1918, many of them filling traditionally male roles. African Americans also contributed greatly to the war effort. Approximately 200,000 African Americans served in combat, while hundreds of thousands more served in support roles. As it turned out, the doughboys did not have to fight across a distant ocean. Hostilities began on the Western Front in 1914. By the time the U.S. entered the conflict, the front lines had stabilized into a stalemate. Trench warfare had become the order of the day, leading to horrific casualties for both sides. Given the manpower situation, then it's not surprising that the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, was sent to bolster the flagging spirits of the French, British, and other allies. The AEF fought in several major engagements during the war, including the Battle of the Argonne Forest, where American forces played a key role in breaking through the Hindenburg Line, a series of defensive fortifications built by the Germans. This victory paved the way for the eventual collapse of the German army. While the fighting was fierce, the AEF suffered fewer casualties than their British, French, and Italian counterparts. Nevertheless, 116,000 Americans lost their lives during the conflict, including nearly 40,000 who died from disease. To win the war, the United States needed more than just an army. Producing munitions, food, clothing, medicine, and supplies for the troops was just as important. Fortunately, American industry was up to the task. The federal government established several agencies to oversee the production of war materials. The War Industries Board, or WIB, encouraged manufacturers to ramp up production of tanks, guns, ammunition, trucks, and airplanes. The WIB also sought to ensure that raw materials were available to meet the demands of the military. The U.S. was not lacking in raw materials, but transporting them to factories was another matter. To meet this challenge, the government created the United States Shipping Board to construct new ships and convert civilian vessels to transport goods. The U.S. Shipping Board Emergency Fleet Corporation ordered over 2,000 new ships to be built during the war, making it one of the largest peacetime expansion programs in naval history. Meanwhile, the Food Administration, headed by Herbert Hoover, worked to ensure that there was enough food to feed the troops in the home front. With the British blockade of Germany in place, importing food from Europe was not an option. Americans would need to tighten their belts and conserve as much as possible. The slogan "Food will win the war" was painted on everything from billboards to schoolbooks. Children were taught to plant victory gardens to supplement the family diet, and farmers were encouraged to grow more wheat, meat, and dairy products. In the end, the United States had emerged victorious, but at what cost? While the U.S. had not been involved in the conflict for very long, the cost of war was still high. In total, the war cost the United States $35.5 billion, an enormous sum in 1920s money. Most of the money spent was for supplies, weapons, food, clothing, medicines, and the salaries of soldiers. Thankfully, not all the expenses were borne by taxpayers. The United States received financial assistance from its allies, particularly Britain, who reimbursed us for the cost of transporting troops across the Atlantic. When all was said and done, the federal government found itself in debt to the tune of $22 billion, which was partially offset by war bonds, which had brought in $20.4 billion. Nonetheless, the war left the United States with a debt of roughly 20% of the nation's gross domestic product. On the plus side, war spending helped boost the economy, keeping the United States out of a recession during the conflict. Additionally, the war led to major advancements in technology, including the internal combustion engine, which would revolutionize transportation in the decades to come. It's difficult to say whether World War I ushered in the Roaring '20s, but it certainly did not hinder the economic boom. In fact, the period immediately following the war saw tremendous growth in industry, business, and personal income. What's more, women had proven themselves capable of working outside the home, and would continue to push for greater equality in the years to come. African Americans, too, were inspired by their wartime service, and began migrating away from the South in search of better opportunities. Not all was well, however. The debt incurred during the war would hang over the nation for years to come. Furthermore, veterans returned home to a sputtering economy and were quick to organize in order to secure their interests. Lastly, the United States had emerged from the conflict with a strong distaste for entangling alliances, which would inform our foreign policy for decades to come. Ultimately, World War I had a profound effect on the United States. From the economy to civil rights to foreign policy, Few aspects of American life were untouched by the conflict. It may not have been the war to end all wars, but it was certainly a war that would change the world forever. Hey, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please consider subscribing to my channel. I'm working on a series of videos about the social, economic, and political history of the United States. Hope you'll be here for it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.